Starship has launched once again, and that means SpaceX is pausing everything and taking a break. Of course not. Starbase is already preparing for Starship's next flight, with work ongoing on the next ship to fly, testing for catching boosters, and a lot more work even beyond that. And as always, there's also Starship-related stuff en route to Starbase that we'll also cover, as it is very important for the future of the program. This is your Starbase Update, sponsored by Novium. Now, before we go into all of the Starship Flight 4 stuff, let's get something out of the way, which is Ship 26's static fire test at Massey's. In case you don't remember, it was only a week ago, but it feels like, I don't know, months ago at this point. SpaceX has been working on a brand new static fire test stand at the Massey's Outpost. Until this location was opened, all of the testing at Starbase was taking place at the launch site, slowing down any work going on there and forcing SpaceX to close Highway 4 a lot of times. SpaceX then moved the ship and booster cryogenic proof tests and all of the test tank testing out to Massey's. Work on this new static fire test stand started around late summer of last year and was finished rather recently. This new stand now allows SpaceX to test ships here too, which reduces the amount of testing going on at the launch site to just booster and static fire tests and any full stack testing that may be necessary. With this test, Ship 26 becomes the first vehicle to static fire at both the now gone suborbital pad and at the Massey's Outpost. The test that took place last week seemed to go well and the flame trench worked as expected. This should hopefully help with the tile loss problem that ships used to have at the suborbital pad during static fires due to the reflected energy from the Raptor engines. Unfortunately, since Ship 26 doesn't have tiles, we could not corroborate if this upgrade to a flame trench helped or not, but rest assured, we will find out one way or another very soon. Sticking with Massey's for a minute, we also have here the B14.1 test tank, which arrived a couple of weeks ago. Back then, we explained that we thought it was most likely to be used for testing the structural integrity of boosters and their lifting points when being caught by the chopsticks. This week, we saw teams installing a new cap on top of this test tank, which features what appears to be pushers that apply force on the lifting points of the booster. This all but confirms our theory that this test tank is most definitely for testing the booster's structural integrity during a catch. As we'll discuss later, this is quite a big deal for the next flight, so the earlier they get this testing done, the better. Before we go all over the crazy stuff that happened on Starship's 4th flight and all of the new footage that has come out from it recently, Jack has a word from our sponsor.
This video was sponsored by Novium. They make really cool magnetically hovering pens, which is perfect because Father's Day is coming up. I challenge you to think of a better dad gift. Novium hover pens are inspired by space, so they're a great and artful way to have a little reminder of the coolness of weightlessness in a workplace. Plus, when you gift them to someone, like say, I don't know, your dad, on Father's Day, every time they look at it, they'll have a cool reminder of space and you. The Interstellar Edition has a tilt of 23.5 degrees, which is reminiscent of the Earth's axis of rotation. They come in cool colors like Space Black and Mars Magma. Plus, there are premium editions made with 18-karat gold, and there's even a real meteorite embedded within them. I personally really like the look of the Future Edition, which also comes with an interchangeable tip so you can switch back and forth between fountain tip or rollerball super easy. I mean, just look at that pen spin. I can see your dad now, spinning it idly as he contemplates the latest unhinged meme you've sent him. Use the code NSF to get 10% off on all hover pens. And use the link in the description so Novium knows we sent you. Thanks to Novium for making a cool product and for sponsoring this video.
If you watched our previous Starbase update video, you may remember that we had seen SpaceX stack Ship 29 on Booster 11 right after installing the flight termination system, but without seemingly completing the heat shield. We were puzzled why this had been the case, and we theorized this may have to do with some sort of tile testing, but then right after we published the episode, SpaceX destacked Ship 29 again. We thought this probably meant SpaceX was going to install the missing tiles and restack again for flight, also thinking that we probably jumped the gun too quickly, saying it was a test. But when Ship 29 was stacked for the final time, it did so with the tiles still missing. SpaceX later confirmed that indeed this was a test of the thermal protection system. This test involved the use of a thinner tile, installing alternate materials for potential future use on the ship, and also installing a lot of instrumentation on the backside of these locations. Right after that Starbase update episode, we also got the modified launch license for Starship, which came up about 2 days prior to launch. The wording on this license makes it look like it could, in theory, be used for flights that have vehicles similar to the ones that flew on Flight 4 and for the mission profile for Flight 4. The FAA also confirmed it had agreed with SpaceX for 3 exceptions that would not trigger a mishap if they were to happen. These exceptions are possible thanks to the existing regulations that allow operators to coordinate with the FAA for potential damage produced to the vehicle as a result of a test during the flight. The 3 exceptions involve the failure of the thermal shield during high heating, the flap system is unable to provide sufficient control under high dynamic pressure, and the failure of the Raptor engine system during the landing burn. So with all the regulatory hurdles out of the way and with Starship fully stacked on the pad, it was time to go into action. Apart from an initial delay due to a tank farm issue, the rest of the countdown went really smoothly, with no holds, which shows SpaceX now has all the pre-launch procedures down very well. Starship finally lifted off at 7:50 in the morning Central, and despite losing an engine right off the pad, Booster 11 was able to complete its ascent and went through hot staging. This time the boost back burn worked well, and Super Heavy was able to go back for a re-entry. If you recall, for this flight, the hot staging ring was supposed to be jettisoned, and indeed it was. Before the flight, we thought this separation had to be done maybe by initiating a flip and kicking it out via inertia, but SpaceX had a trick up their sleeve. We could see after separation on this view from the forward dome of the booster at least 2 of the pushers they used for this hot staging ring jettison. It seems like these pushers were quietly added onto the booster as it was inside the megabay before the ring was installed. According to SpaceX prior to flight, the ring had to be jettisoned to reduce the amount of mass of the booster for the landing, and it seems like this may have paid off. By the way, you can also see on this view how the hot staging ring passes by in the distance. Quite funny. The booster re-entered the atmosphere using its grid fins and was able to go all the way till the point of the landing burn. Of course, going a few times the speed of sound through the lower parts of the atmosphere causes a ton of vibration, and it kinda looks like the booster is about to come apart, but in reality this was all bark but no bite. At the time of the landing burn, only 12 out of the 13 engines ignited, and we did see debris then coming off the booster, but that could be related to that engine going out at ignition. Despite that engine out, Booster 11 really did not even flinch and continued down to a soft splashdown on the ocean with its Center 3 engines. Now all of this can be seen in better context thanks to SpaceX's video after the flight, where they show what the landing looked like from external cameras. We can see at first what appears to be an aerial view of the booster as it approaches the start of the landing burn. There's a massive vapor cone that's produced as the booster slows down just by pure atmospheric drag. The image is a bit fuzzy, so it's hard to tell how big that vapor cone is in reality, but it seems to have been anywhere between 140 and 170 meters wide, so even larger than a full Starship Super Heavy stack. The view then switched to a 360 camera mounted on a buoy that captured the landing burn. This means all of the people on the internet that years ago were wishing for a buoy camera to record Falcon 9 landings now finally get their treat, but with a Super Heavy landing instead. We hope you're all happy now. From that view, we can see the booster transitioning from the 12 engines that had ignited down to 3 engines. You can notice that when this happens, a massive cloud of fire rises up the booster. If you were around for the hop tests and all of the static fires on the pad and whatnot, you can see that Raptor is quite a show-off when shutting down and likes to produce sizable flames. Fiery landings shouldn't be a problem for the future as long as it lasts a few seconds. We see something similar even with Falcon 9, where some flames remain around the octaweb after landing for a few seconds, but then they burn out. While Booster 11 was doing all of that, Ship 29 quietly kept pushing through with its 6 engines and completed a successful ascent, the second time for Starship. It then coasted through space and prepared for re-entry. This time there was no fancy tests in 0G or anything, it was all about re-entry. Entry started to become visible at around 108 kilometers, with plasma starting to build up on the belly of the ship. The intensity kept growing and the colours kept changing. Somehow, Ship 29 was going through re-entry with no issues. Mission Control kept calling nominal trajectory, nominal temperatures. Ship 29 passed the maximum heating region, which was the main goal of this mission. While Ship 29 re-entered, we could see the speed going down, and at one point the vehicle kept an almost constant altitude of about 68 kilometers, demonstrating it was creating lift at hypersonic speeds. While the ship was able to survive the first half of re-entry, towards the middle of it we started seeing sparks flying by and then plasma appearing through the seal between the starboard forward flap and the nose cone. It was clear that there had been a burn through in the flap aerocover and, well, the flap started to melt. Everyone thought this was going to be the end of Ship 29, but surprise, surprise, it kept going. Not only did it keep going, but the flap was still able to move. Given the damage induced on this flap, we have to assume that the rest of the flaps also suffered similar damage in one way or another. Once the ship slowed down enough, it transitioned from its high-pitch attitude to the skydiving maneuver that we had already seen during the 10-kilometer hops. The ship maintained control all the way through to the flip and landing burn, which it successfully executed and landed softly in the Indian Ocean, finally completing a launch to landing mission for a Starship vehicle for the first time. It's interesting to note that despite the several design iterations since the 10-kilometer hops, this flip and landing burn appeared to still be very similar to the ones we saw back then. All three engines lit up, we could see the three flashes on the camera view, then the forward flap, which somehow was still moving, moved to a flat orientation for the start of the flip. The ship flipped to vertical and then shut down at least one engine. You can see the flash of the shutdown. Remember, I was just saying that Raptors like to show off at shutdown? We then saw the ship slowing down and the effect it had on the water as it kicked it up. If we compare this whole process, for example, to SN10, we can see that despite SN10 not being able to slow down fast enough, Ship 29 took less time from the start of the flip to eventually coming down to a rest. This may indicate that while the flip and landing burn process is still the same, there were likely optimizations that allowed the ship to take less time for it to land. Elon confirmed on X, formerly known as Twitter, after the flight that both stages had splashed down successfully despite all of the challenges. The booster landed on target and the ship was off by a few kilometers due to the flap damage. Elon also said on X about the issue with the flap burn through. "We will have to get this nailed for the next flight." So we should see a lot of work ahead of Flight 5 to precisely solve this issue. He also mentioned that, quote, "a newer version of Starship has the forward flaps shifted leeward. This will help improve reliability, ease of manufacturing, and payload to orbit." This is most likely referring to version 2, so we should expect much better re-entries and landings from version 2 ships than what we've seen with Ship 29. As for the next booster, well, he also said the goal now is for the next booster to be caught back on the chopsticks. Sounds quite challenging, but, well, you know SpaceX already, they like their challenges. Ahead of Starship's next flight, we obviously always think about the paperwork side of things, and well, as of recording, the FAA has not said yet if this flight triggered a mishap investigation or not. Our own Adrian got the statement from the FAA that they're still looking at whether this is the case or not. This is good news because on previous flights the agency had confirmed a mishap investigation was needed almost immediately after the flight had ended, whereas now it's going to take some time. We're all expecting it will not trigger a mishap investigation based on how the flight went and the fact that none of the events during this flight fits any of the definitions of a mishap per the regulations. In any case, we'll keep a close eye on it. Another thing we'll be looking at will be whether SpaceX will need a license modification to include a booster catch on the chopsticks. We'll try to ask the FAA and we'll report back when we get an answer. We definitely want to be on top of it. One interesting thing that SpaceX mentioned during their mission coverage was that in order to prepare for a catch in the near future, they'd be commanding the chopsticks to move into a catching position shortly after liftoff in order to demonstrate that they could work for a catch in the future. We in fact saw that movement, and then later the chopsticks closed all the way soon after the booster landed.
As you might imagine, it takes a little bit of time to pull in 12 plus hours of footage from 25 plus cameras around Starbase, so at the time of writing we hadn't seen every single angle at every single time, but we did catch something interesting. Approximately 7 minutes into flight, around when the booster would have been landing, the deluge system started up again. This is completely independent from the launch activation of this system. It just bursts up again under an empty orbital launch mount, so it's safe to assume that SpaceX might be activating this system for the booster catch attempt on the next flight. I mean, why else would they turn it on?
It was certainly good to see that everything was still working minutes after the world's most powerful rocket had passed between them and then been within meters of them. With Ship 29 and Booster 11 now having flown, our eyes turn to the next pair of vehicles, Ship 30 and Booster 12. Booster 12 continues to be shy and it is still hiding inside of the Mega Bay, but it should come out soon for engine testing if SpaceX wants to launch again relatively quickly. As for Ship 30, we saw this week it was being lifted in the high bay by the bay's bridge crane without being set down on a ship transport stand or onto the turntable, which means it got engines replaced. This opens up an important question. Will Ship 30 have to undergo engine testing again? Well, if it does need engine testing, we should see it rolling out to Massey's for testing on the new stand, so stay tuned to Starbase Live to see what happens with it in the future. This week we also had progress on future boosters. Booster 15's common dome section and the barrel section immediately below it were seen going into the Mega Bay. This weekend, Sean spotted the following barrel also staged outside of the Mega Bay, so that means work is well underway stacking this vehicle. If SpaceX doesn't skip any boosters, then this would be the booster for Starship's 8th flight. Starbase crews have also been very busy all across the launch site while preparing this 4th launch of Starship. We saw this week work beginning on drilling the foundations for more tanks to be added to the Orbital tank farm. During the Starship coverage, SpaceX confirmed that the 2nd Orbital launch pad won't have its own dedicated tank farm, but rather the existing one will be extended and upgraded to supply both launch pads. This was dubbed during the stream as Tank Farm 2.0. We don't really know how many more tanks will be added, but there's plenty of space around the launch site to add a lot more fuel storage. Right after the launch took place, we saw the SpaceX branded LR-11000 crane finally waking up and then rolling to the tank farm to resume work dismantling the remaining vertical tanks. And speaking of cranes, this week we saw documentation coming out for the crane that should help build the 2nd Starship launch and catch tower at Starbase. While in the past, SpaceX used an LR-11350 crane to stack Starship launch towers, this time around SpaceX will be using a Terex Demag CC8800-1. Certainly a beautiful name. This new crane can lift more than the LR-11350 crane that was used for the first Starbase tower and the Starship launch tower at Launch Complex 39A, which means it will likely be able to lift more completed tower sections without problems. And speaking of launch tower sections, we actually talked about this last week, but they're actually on their way now. Sections 4 and 5 of the 2nd launch tower at Starbase have departed the Kennedy Space Center and are already on their way to the port of Brownsville. Along for the ride and tightly packed in the same barge are the chopstick carriage system and the chopsticks themselves. All of this hardware should be arriving in a week or two, so watch out for Starbase Live coverage of when that happens. This week we also saw at Starbase the arrival of parts for the base of the tower. If you remember from the last 2 towers, their base was mostly built up of concrete and then shields were added to protect the base from the fury of the Raptor engines on Super Heavy. Well, this time around SpaceX is building the base out of steel. That will be filled up with concrete, probably based on the experience with the first Starbase launch tower. This will hopefully reduce the turnaround time in the future and improve the resilience of the structure of the tower as well. Speaking of future stuff, this week we also had an announcement from Axiom and SpaceX that they had completed alongside NASA a joint test of the SpaceX airlock systems and the Axiom EVA suits for the Artemis program. In these integrated tests, NASA astronaut Douglas Wheelock and Axiom's Director of Human Spaceflight Peggy Whitson, who's a former NASA astronaut, involved the steps needed to just get out of the HLS Starship and step onto the lunar surface. Both put on the Axiom lunar EVA suit while being kept at pressure, and both practiced getting out of the airlock and going on the Starship elevator down to the lunar surface. This integrated test allows teams to tweak procedures, get feedback from astronauts on the flexibility and agility of the suits, and also the layout and mechanics of Starship's interior. Saying that last part already sounds a bit crazy that we will soon have people on board Starship, albeit after having launched on another rocket. In any case, it's quite exciting to see progress being made on the crew side of things for the HLS program, and we hope to see a lot more from it. Of course, right after every Starship flight, there's a lot of work to do on the pad to refurbish it for the next flight, which means work continues on the orbital launch mount. Taking a quick look at the status of the pad after launch, it appears the ship quick disconnect umbilical is once again bent off its normal position, but we've seen SpaceX teams repair this before. It shouldn't be a showstopper for the next flight. As usual, the launch mount is scorched after suffering through the power of the Raptors. We'll see how much refurbishment is actually needed once we see them stop doing work on the OLM and preparing it for flight. Perhaps all of this scorching is just aesthetic, but I guess we'll find out. Booster 12 coming here for static fire testing is also not really a good indicator of a rapid turnaround, because the OLM may have been ready in time for the static fire, but not for a launch.
Just as I was editing this episode of Starbase Update, the man himself, Elon Musk, started live streaming onto his gaming alt account on X and also leaked some Starship information, and we've just found out that he thinks Flight 5 will be in just about a month's time, and Ship 30's heat shield will be entirely replaced with new tiles which will be apparently 2 times as strong as the tiles on Ship 29.
So the new heat shield tile is about twice as strong as the ones that were on the last flight,
with an additional ablative protection underneath that will act as a secondary heat shield layer, presumably to try and protect against what we saw with the flaps on Ship 29 during Reentry.
So with Flight 4 now behind us, when do you think Flight 5 might happen? Is a relatively short turnaround possible, or will we have to wait? Thanks again to Novium for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use the code NSF to get 10% off, or use the link in the description. Well, that's going to be it for this week, and what a crazy week it was. Once again, a huge thank you to everybody who has been supporting and watching us over the last few days. We couldn't do this without you. I'm Caton for NSF, thanks for watching, and goodbye.